Yeats, Ablenationalism and Fascism for Ireland and Revolution. Last time out we looked at Foucault's theory of biopolitics, which was his new addition to his analysis of power that had been concentrated around the ideas of sovereign power and disciplinary power. Sovereign power being the traditional power associated with monarchs and taken over by the monopoly on violence expressed in the state, as defined by Max Weber. And disciplinary power being a new set of techniques and tactics that functioned to convert the individual, or rather produce the individual of industrial capital, the worker, the disciplined worker, the regularized worker, the docile bodies, as Foucault calls them, of capitalism. In the 19th century for Foucault, a new kind of governmentality, a new set of techniques of government were produced, which he calls biopolitical. And by this he means the governance of people as peoples at the level of population. And this includes all sorts of measures around pronatalism, birth control, the politics of reproduction, life assurance, etc. Foucault's privileged example in Society Must Be Defended was Nazism. And at the end of that series of lectures, and we looked at the last of the lectures, he talks about a kind of an internal paroxysm in National Socialism, whereby Hitler's murder machine turned on the German people itself in that infamous moment towards the end of the war when he ordered the dismantling of the means of life of the German people. However, Hitler's first victims in Nazi Germany, the first people to be put to death systematically in the camps, were actually Germans, and they were German people with disabilities. They were a set of individuals designated under the now familiar to us category of degenerates. This included alcoholics, homosexuals, people with disabilities, people with deformities, inverted commas, and so forth. We've seen what degeneration was. It was a more or less fanciful hypothesis of decline projected onto Western civilization based on a kind of spurious misreading of Lamarckian and later Darwinian theories. The most disastrous aspect of Darwin's legacy is social Darwinism, whereby the mechanics of natural selection, selection in a natural environment, were projected onto society as though society were itself a natural environment. And then the logic of fitness, unfitness, and selection was transposed onto the social body. All of a sudden now, the only question was, why, if progress was not being made towards a kind of evolutionary fitness, if paradoxically, as Max Nordau claimed, degenerates managed to outstrip the fit in regenerating, the question became how to identify the misfits, the unfit, how to locate and purge the lag, the internal lag to society's progress. And the problem with a logic like this, which was always, of course, going to be refracted through racism, classism, sexism, ableism. The problem with this kind of logic is that the person doing the looking is never the one likely to be designated by themselves as the one who has to die. Everyone is looking now outside of themselves for the problem. In this paper by Simona Forti, The Biopolitics of Souls, Racism, Nazism, and Plato, Simona Forti responds to Foucault to suggest that whilst biologism may be part of the story, a study of the ideology of Nazism itself, and specifically the ideology of the soldiers in the trenches, reveals the importance of a Platonic tradition of what she calls the metaphysics of form, that she later calls morphological racism, and which we might call lookism. The idea that we project a moral judgment onto physical appearance, so that the people who look the best are deemed to be the best, which, as you can tell, is a fairly fascinated and inadequate judgment of ethics. But it's what happens when aesthetics and ethics get conflated. When, to quote the Grecian urn, the speaking pot at the end of Keats's second poem of the two famous immortality odes, Ode on a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That's parroting, the urn in that poem is parroting the logic of Plato's Republic. And there's a problem going back to Plato, in that whenever Plato is asked to define truth, capital T, he tends to refer us to beauty as if beauty is a known thing against which truth can be inferred. And this morphology, this sense that there are forms that are true and beautiful, form part of our brief excursion into the Republic, alongside what we saw as Plato's politics of breeding, a politics of breeding that Yeats takes over wholesale in his work from at least, in fact, probably from the earliest part of his career, but certainly by the time of our poem in 1910, Upon a House Shaken by the Land Agitation, the best knitted to the best. And later on, the Second Coming, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. All of that is the politics of breeding of the Republic. Plato uses the example time and again of animal husbandry, of breeding the best animals with the best animals to produce the best animals. And he again transposes that logic of nature onto human society. So Nazism is, in a sense, what happens when this morphological racism gets hooked up to the technological progress of modernity, the military expertise, and the mega machine of the totalitarian state to produce megadeath at a scale unseen previously. But that's not the only thing that Yeats takes over. The politics of breeding is not the only thing that Yeats takes over from Plato. He's also interested in this metaphysics of form, this notion of lookism or of morphological racism. That people around you look the way they are, and the way they look can become an index of how they are to be treated. You remember in the poem A Prayer for My Daughter, his preoccupation with her physical appearance as an index of her morality, that people who are made too beautiful become morally distorted. That's the very essence of the kind of morphological racism that has its roots in Plato. And Foucault said in his essay on biopolitics that one reason why sexuality became such a preoccupation in the 19th century, and arguably sexuality as a concept was invented around this time. Foucault's History of Sexuality in 3 volumes makes this case, that before that there may have been acts of sex, but the idea of sexuality itself as a kind of ongoing process of being sexual in certain ways, the difference between sodomy and being a homosexual, inverted commas. All of this was invented in the 19th century. One reason for that, Foucault says, is because disciplinary power is targeting the body, biopower targets the population, and sexuality is where the politics of the body and the politics of population and regeneration intersect. So this 40 paper is a really important paper to help us refract Foucault's analysis through the history of Platonism. And the reason why Plato is so important for us is because, as we've seen in the great poems of the Tower, which constitute Yeats's response to not just World War I and the Easter Rising, but later the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War, is that he begins to cultivate this notion of Platonic forms. He begins to withdraw from materiality, from the real, from the dying generations, into a preoccupation with timeless and immutable truths. He chooses Plato over Aristotle in the somewhat simplified binary of Raphael's painting The School of Athens. So you can see here that Forty talks about the notion of race as indexed not only to the body, but to the soul. And there's a sense in which the soul is the inner reality of a physical appearance, which is itself the outer index of a kind of metaphysics of perfectibility. That the evolution that the Nazis were interested in was as much metaphysical as physical. It was about the perfection of the soul of the race and of the embodiment of the type, the ideal type of the race. It was, as she says, evolutionist racism uses race as an instrument for the naturalization of social and political history. What Forty wants to suggest here is that this notion of a kind of perfectible soul, this refraction of racism through form rather than genetics, is important to understanding the aesthetics of Nazism. And I want to suggest it's also really important in understanding the aesthetics of Yeatsianism. If we go back to Kathleen Ni Houlihan at this point and ask ourselves the question, how is the blood sacrifice of the young men of Ireland figured in that play? We can see that it is figured in a transfiguration of an old woman bent over, almost destroyed by history, stoic but dispossessed, who is converted into a young woman with the walk of a queen. In other words, it's the posture and the regeneration, the turning back of the clock of aging, together with a kind of a straightening up of the physical form of the woman, that indicates that the blood that has been sacrificed into the soil of Ireland has regenerated it. And the allegorical embodiment of that regeneration is this youthful, upright woman. That is republicanism embodying a logic that would become, with certain significant changes, the logic of Nazism. So at this point, we have to render the distinction between the two. The distinction is an important one, although it's not as absolute as we might like. In republicanism, Yeats says that if the Irish men sacrifice themselves, their blood sacrifice will regenerate Ireland. Nazism was going to sacrifice other people, and it was the blood of other people that were going to regenerate Germany. Though, of course, Germans had to also be willing to die in huge numbers as part of the death cult of Nazism. So we can see how from his earliest career onwards, Yeats was given to a kind of logic. It had a notion of greatness in the past, and this it shared with Hitler's view of Germany. It had a notion of humiliation in the present through colonialism, and this it shared with Hitler's Germany in the sense that World War I was seen as the great humiliation. It had a sense of racism of form, that the shape of people was an index of their mental and moral health. And it also had the idea that blood sacrifice was the means to regenerate the nation as individual. And this it shared with Nazism. Foucault makes the point that it also shared it with Stalinist socialism. So the difference for Forty in the biopolitics of souls is that rather than talking about animalistic bestiality, the kind of thing we saw in the cartoons of the two rivals, where the dynamitard of Irish land politics was seen as a kind of Caliban figure, a simian ape, a throwback, an atavistic throwback on the evolutionary scale, is that the language of this new logic, which she sees in Nazism, replaces the image of the beast with the image of the parasite and the infective agent. So that what's needed now is a purification of the blood and a kind of cold disinfection. Eugenics had the logic that bloodlines were either pure or contaminated. And they could be contaminated or purified through a kind of selective breeding, back to the Platonic idea. Either there was positive eugenics, where you just got the best of the best and bred them positively together, but there was also the flip side of this, negative eugenics, where you kept the worst away from the best through the link of contamination. So if you go through this paper by 40, you'll get a lot of helpful material on the kind of Platonic logic of the morphological racism that Yeats is interested in his last play, Purgatory. We saw how Yeats's engagement with degeneration theory was complicated very much by the fact that Yeats's aesthetic practices were themselves, in the logic of degeneration theory, degenerate, indices of degeneracy. All of the governing preoccupations of Yeats's early work, his mysticism, and so forth, would have been quintessential degenerate art in Max Nordau's analysis. But then, so was Tolstoy, so was Ibsen, so was Nietzsche, so were the French symbolists, so were the Impressionist painters, so were the pre-Raphaelites. What Max Nordau was actually doing, what he was actually criticizing, was modernism. Modernism as a disintegration of classical aesthetic forms. But he was linking this as a doctor, Max Nordau was a medical doctor, to deformations of the physical body. In other words, that the disintegration of the art was an index of the disintegration of the psyche that produced it. Yeats couldn't take on the entirety of the degeneration hypothesis because he was himself, as an artist, a degenerate. He wasn't going to give up mysticism in his early days, and when he turned away from the kind of early Celtic twilight mysticism, he retained, until the very end of his life, an enduring preoccupation with symbolism. And for Max Nordau, symbolism was a clear index of the kind of brain fog of the degenerate artist. Why would you use a symbol when you can just say the thing you wanted to say? And there are entire chapters on symbolism in Max Nordau's Degeneration. If you go to his chapter on Ibsen, for example, he goes at Ibsen in no uncertain terms for his symbolism. But there's also a chapter on the symbolist poets, whom Yeats admired. You remember in the early essay, Hopes and Fears, Yeats diagnosed Western civilization as declining, in degeneration, or rather, as degenerating and in decline, using Paul Verlaine as his example. And Paul Verlaine had been used by Max Nordau as a privileged example. But in those early essays, Yeats exempted Ireland from the diagnosis of degeneration on the basis that it was a young nation. And he would go on to suggest that one of the ways it could escape or cheat the degenerative logic of history was through blood sacrifice in the Republican tradition. After he moved away from Republicanism, after he was disenchanted with that movement, not just because of its embrace of Catholicism after the fall of Parnell, but also because of his own falling out with Maud Gonne, who was in many ways his embodied ideal of a Republican politics. And the rest of his poetry, as we've seen around women and beauty and morality and politics with Constance Markievicz, are kind of a displaced, rejected lover's quarrel with the politics of the woman whom he believed he had some kind of fated connection with. But these problems have been there from the beginning, as we've seen, this degenerate stuff. And so what Yeats is trying to do, he's split in a sense. His politics are vintage degeneration politics, and his art is vintage degenerate art. And he has to find a way to marry the two. But there's certainly no question that he gave up on the notion of symbolism, because if you go to read the play Purgatory, study that tree, the tree in the play is quite obviously pitched as a symbol. In fact, towards the end of the play, he says, study that tree, it's symbolical. Purgatory, then, is the last work that we're going to be looking at. But it has links of continuity with Kathleen Ní Houliháin. Both are plays about blood sacrifice. But as we've seen, Kathleen Ní Houliháin is about the sacrifice of young men to the nation. In Purgatory, a young boy is sacrificed, but it's a kind of a family romance. The entire play is set outside the ruins of a big house. By 1938, by 1903, the big house tradition in Ireland had been effectively dismantled by the British colonial state in a period of constructive unionism. A series of land acts had effectively purchased the land from Irish landlords and then resold it at affordable rates to the tenants on the land, creating a real revolution in land ownership in Ireland. And it was at this time, when any viable basis for a landed politics of ascendancy of colonialism, of Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, had been effectively dismantled, that Yeats began to cultivate his affiliations with it. And his late poetry, like Cool Park, 1929, and so forth, there are many poems about ruined big houses, and Purgatory is one of them. What happens in the play is that a man and his son, whom he describes in quite extraordinarily racist, morphological racist terms as a bastard, a father and son confront, and I'm just opening the book here to get the play open to me, come upon a ruined house and a bare tree in the background. It turns out that this is where the old man was himself begotten. But his birth, or his conception rather, was a crime against the people that he represents. The reason being, he tells his son, that his mother made the decision, or rather fell in love with, a stable hand. So that this is another play or another piece of Yeatsian work which is preoccupied with biopolitics, with population, with contamination of the line of ascendancy and inheritance, and with the purification of that line through blood sacrifice. In this case, the old man stabs his son in order to put an end to the line of inheritance which is contaminated by the blood of the stable hand. In earlier drafts of Purgatory, Yeats is more clear on the fact that the stable hand would have been a native Irish Catholic, so that there is a politics of ethnic purity and religious identity that is barely suppressed in the play. But he talks about the stable hand being not of the mother's kind. She should have known he was not her kind. In other words, he's the offspring himself of a mixed marriage. Do not let him touch you. It is not true that drunken men cannot beget. And if touch, he must beget, and you must bear his murderer. So by this time late in his life, Yeats is fairly deep into blood sacrifice, contamination, morphological racism, but also the politics of sectarian identity, with a Protestant ascendancy as a kind of embattled minority in Ireland who need to husband and protect their procreative resources, i.e. their women's uteruses, from contamination by Catholics. And that's the logic of the play. The notion of purgatory is important in the play, and it's important for us to understand what Yeats means by it, because he has taken over from Catholic doctrine, the doctrine of purgatory, there being no tradition of purgatory in the Protestant church. So what is a Protestant writer doing, preoccupying himself with a Catholic theology, purgatory, in the name of a kind of excoriation of Catholicism in the form of the sexual identity of the stable hand? Well, there's another play from around 1934 that Yeats wrote about Dean Swift and a seance. It's a quintessential Yeatsian play because it has plenty of ghosts and magic and seances and Emanuel Swedenborg in it. And in that play, a Dr. Trench explains Yeats's theory of dreaming back. And the play Purgatory that we're looking at is an example of this dreaming back. So I'll just give you the statement from Dr. Trench explaining it to a Mrs. Mallet about what happens when a spirit gets trapped in purgatory as a function of crime or guilt. Sometimes a spirit relives not the pain of death, but some tragic, passionate or tragic moment of life. Swedenborg describes this and gives the reason for it. There is an incident of the kind in the Odyssey and many in Eastern literature. The murderer repeats his murder, the robber his robbery, the lover his serenade, the soldier hears the trumpet once again. If I were a Catholic, I would say that such spirits were in purgatory. In vain do we write requiescat in pace upon their tomb, for they must suffer. And we in turn must suffer until God gives peace. Such spirits do not often come to seances unless those seances are held in houses where those spirits lived, or where the event took place. This spirit which speaks those incomprehensible words and does not answer when spoken to is of such a nature. The more patient we are, the more quickly it will pass out of its passion and remorse. So the old man and the boy in purgatory, with the tree in the house, are passing the house which is the scene of the crime, of contamination, of the bloodline of the family of the big house, by the affair of the woman of the house with a stable hand who is working in the stables with whom she falls in love. It's a classic play around sexual politics and male preoccupation with women, because the woman of the house generally betrays the house and its traditions, its customs and its ceremonies, all of the things that Yeats is preoccupied with in A Prayer for My Daughter. They're usually betrayed with a kind of a virile example of the native stock, as if there was something animalistic and insatiable about the Irish Catholic native. The bit of rough trade would be the kind of pejorative phrase. But Yeats has another problem in his old age, which we saw in Sailing to Byzantium and a number of his late works, is that he himself is sexually impotent and living a life of more or less sustained regret around his own declining potency. This is a problem for ableists and ageists generally. Ableism and ageism are two prejudices that don't age well. Because if you think you're young and beautiful, and that people who aren't beautiful and young deserve to die, or be put in the scrap heap, or murdered in the Foucauldian sense of just declined participation in society, excluded from meaningful discourse. This is what Samuel Beckett literalizes in Endgame when he puts two old people in dustbins on the stage. He's literalizing the metaphor of waste, of wastedness that societies project onto older people through ageism and ableism. And this is why Hitler's deformed, inverted commas, and people with disabilities, the mentally retarded and the mentally handicapped, as they were called at the time, these were his first victims. They were the first into the trash heap because they were the first and most obviously useless to the task of regenerating Germany. And Yeats had a lot of this logic in him. The problem being then, what happens as you get older yourself? Do you yourself deserve to die? Are you yourself part of the scrap heap? If that is no country for old men, what does Yeats do? Well, in Sailing to Byzantium, as we saw, he withdraws to a world of fantasy in Byzantium, a land, an empire in which, as he saw it, art, politics, and religion had been united in a kind of unity of being. But in order to cultivate his relationship with Byzantium, he has to leave nature, the dying generations. He's back, as we suggested, in Keats's paradox, that there is no objective correlative. There is no thing that can embody the possibility of cheating death that is not itself subject to death. Keats thought the nightingale was an immortal bird, and then he realized that it wasn't. So that Yeats ends up, in that extraordinary poem, Sailing to Byzantium, imagining himself as a metal bird sitting in a tree singing to an emperor to keep the emperor from falling asleep. This is the problem of aesthetics at the intersection of death. Since Shakespeare and before Shakespeare, but in those great sonnets about you'll be dead, but this poem will be alive, and so you'll be remembered in this poem, all those early sonnets, since at least then, there's been a sense in which one of the functions of poetry has been to attempt to achieve immortality for the author or the subject of the poem, as though being forever in a poem was a form of immortality, a way of escaping death. And you can see now the attraction of Plato over Aristotle, because Aristotle's interested in corruption, generation, regeneration, and matter, whereas Plato is interested in Platonic forms, the immutable, the eternal, the ideal. So it's the ideal versus the material, or the ideal versus the real. And because he is himself split, Yeats, as the great artist that he was, kind of oscillates between an affiliation with idealism and a kind of beautifully vulnerable, frank admission of the decrepitude of aging. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. This image of the scarecrow recurs in his late work. So in Purgatory, we see an example of dreaming back. The reason why this house lights up at night and the crime or the night of the conception of the old man is relived by his mother in Purgatory is because she is living out the guilt of having contaminated the bloodline. And the play's bloodthirsty logic, the blood sacrifice logic of the play, is that if the old man kills the young boy who is his son, whom he describes, and let me just find he talks about his education. Let's see if we can find it in here. The peddler. This extraordinary comment about the peddler. I gave you, he says to his son, the education that befits a bastard that a peddler got upon a tinker's daughter in a ditch. When I had come to 16 years old, my father burned down the house when drunk. So that the politics of purity are here in no uncertain terms. And this is where the discomfort, the obvious discomfort with Yeats's late politics, given that this is 1938 and we're about to enter Nazi Germany's I don't know what to describe it as. We're about to witness the most extraordinary events of World War II, and here's Yeats kind of bloodthirstily calling for a purification of the bloodline of the Protestant peoples of Ireland through blood sacrifice. So he may not have known precisely what he was wishing for, but artists like Samuel Beckett, who survived the war and actually fought with the resistance during the war, spent a lot of time after the war responding to Yeats in his arts, in his writing, to say things like, this is what you wanted, Yeats, this is what you wished for, and look what you got, look what you're a part of. A lot of the preoccupation with disability, degeneration, and deformity, in other words, in Beckett's work, is a response to the politics of regeneration, purity, and reform, transfiguration in Yeats. That there's an argument going on there in plays like Happy Days. If you're interested in Beckett and you're interested in the play like Waiting for Godot, for example, think about the fact that those two men are sitting on a stage with just a tree. It's Purgatory minus the house. Okay, so that's going to be the end of the course. Yeats in Revolution. It was a first attempt to teach this course, and with COVID and everything else, I don't really feel that we got halfway towards what I was hoping to achieve. It's very difficult, I have found, to teach poetry without the conversation in the classroom. I'm often provoked into positions in the classroom that surprise me as much as anybody else, but just sitting here trying to free associate about the contents of the poems hasn't really gotten me where I was hoping to get to. Nevertheless, I hope that you can see that there's been a kind of logic to the course. It's often said that Yeats's career can be divided into three stages: early republicanism, the public poet of indignation in Free State Ireland, and then he cultivates a kind of Anglo-Irish solitude. When he buys the tower in Tourballylee, spends his time eulogizing Lady Gregory and excoriating Ireland. his preoccupation with the politics of reproduction, his own Steinac operation, which is meant to regenerate his libido. These are the three stages. But what we've seen in this course, I hope, is that there's a kind of an underlying logic, a common thread that runs through all of Yeats's work. And that's this morphological racism, this preoccupation with aesthetic form and physical form as kind of indices, one of the other. There's a sense in which healthy politics and healthy poetry and healthy progeny are all intricated in Yeats's imagination. And that blood sacrifice, the idea that you have to die for your country, becomes later in plays or poems like A Prayer for My Daughter, the biopolitical equivalent that you have to live for your people. Now, to be fair to Yeats, the politics of reproduction in Ireland after Irish independence are notorious. That contraception and literature advocating contraception was banned. The Vatican put out a very hurtful decree called the Ne Temere Decree, which said that if any Protestant and Catholic got married, the children of the mixed marriage would have to be raised as Catholics, effectively consigning Protestants to extinction, even in their own acts of reproduction. And to understand Yeats's indignation and his preoccupation with his daughter and his son and the politics of ascendancy, you have to refract it through the Catholic theocratic politics of the Irish Free State and later Irish Republic. The Irish Revolution has been described as the most conservative revolution in history. And there was an immediate counter-revolution, which is the subject of a great book by the historian John Regan, The Irish Counter-Revolution, which shows you that from 1921 and the War of Independence to 1936 and the eve of Eamon de Valera's great Irish Constitution, most of the revolutionary potential of the Irish War of Independence had been obviated in the name of a Catholic elite. It was almost inevitable, because Protestant imperialism had been the force that the Irish were fighting, that in identity and opposition to that Protestant imperialism, a kind of Catholic nationalism would be created. And it came with its own oppressive politics, especially around reproduction, morality, and mores. And Irish women bore the brunt of this preoccupation, as the history of Magdalens and incarcerations, emigration of queers, dissidents, and so forth amply attests. The history of modern Irish shame. So Yeats is in a quarrel with Ireland all his life. Early on, he thinks he can lead Ireland to a kind of Republican redemption. Then he begins to see that Ireland is not listening to him and is not interested in his diagnosis of its ills or his diagnosis of its cure. The Irish outmaneuvered Yeats, and that's the great period of 1916 and the rebellion, that they enacted the blood sacrifice that he liked to fantasize and pontificate about. And around that time, he began to see a different future for himself as an embodiment of ascendancy, of the great people of Burke and Grattan. And this is why he writes a play about Dean Swift in Ireland, another great member of the kind of besieged, cultured people of the Protestant heritage, stuck on an island with the kind of backwards Catholic majority. But in Purgatory, this preoccupation with purity, with decontamination, with the metaphysics of form, morphological racism, and what has been called recently Ablenationalism, the idea that nations always choose the fittest of the fit to represent the country, implying that people who are not fit to represent the country are not, in some sense, fully a part of the country's body politic. Foucault calls it the internal racism of biopolitics. That Yeats is preoccupied with this kind of logic, and it leads him to some pretty bloodthirsty scenes. And Purgatory is arguably his most notorious play. The point that many people make in seeking to exonerate Yeats from mere Nazism, and I think it would be a mistake to say that he was in any obvious, straightforward sense merely fascist. He's split, as we've seen. The logic of degeneration shapes his politics, but the logic of degeneration also shapes his art. And at the end of this play, having murdered his son, the preoccupation with money is there in this play as well, going back to Kathleen Ni Houlihan. You'll notice that what he's trying to do by killing his son is putting an end to this line of contamination. If I should kill a man under the window. But what happens, of course, is that it doesn't work. That the hoofbeats come back, and that the scene reenacts itself again, and that killing the son and ending the contaminated bloodline is not enough to expiate the guilt of contamination in this extraordinary play. That his mother's crime, the crime of choosing a man who was not of her own kind, her own class, her own religion, her own cultural background, cannot actually be prevented or cleansed or purged by blood sacrifice. Whether that's enough to make you feel comfortable about Yeats's bloodthirsty logic here is for you to decide. But we end with the tree, standing like a purified soul, except that it isn't purified, and that nothing that the old man has done in the play has done anything to prevent the crime of contamination from reverberating throughout Irish history. And this is Yeats on the eve of his own death, embracing the fact that sometimes, as Beckett would go on to say in the play Waiting for Godot, which is Purgatory's sequel, sometimes there is nothing to be done.